Inside Oak High School in Wichita, Kansas, a teacher closed his classroom door. School had been over for an hour, and the man walked down the hallway, heading home after a long day. Three teenage boys watched as he turned the corner at the end of the hall. When the teacher was out of sight, they stepped out from their hiding place behind a row of lockers. The boys opened one of the lockers. Stuffed inside was an unhappy George Duvall. The three boys, Matt, Steve, and Kurt, yanked the unwilling George out of the locker, and Kurt handed him a camera. Here, now that the teacher's left, you can get in the classroom and make us proud, you freak. We want pictures of tomorrow's test. George, who was smaller than each of the other boys, tried to push the camera away. But I don't want to. Kurt grabbed hold of George's shirt collar and pulled him close. Wrapping his arm tightly around George's neck, he sneered, "Did anyone ask what you wanted?" George gulped and shook his head. As Matt punched his right fist into his left hand, he said, "Then get in there before I put my fist in your eye so you won't be able to see even when you're not invisible." "Yeah, it's hard to see with two black eyes," Steve said as he held his fist right up under George's nose. "Get the picture?" George gulped again, nodding. Kurt released George, who reluctantly took the camera. At a construction site in Chicago, several workers in hard hats stood around a pile of large metal support beams lying on the ground. Numerous boulders were scattered around the site. An empty dump truck was the only vehicle parked on the lot. A muscular foreman shouted orders. "All right, we'll just have to do what we can for now. We should have another bulldozer within a day or two." Chester, wearing his suit and tie, approached the foreman. Chester was carrying one of his 100-pound weights with a newspaper tied to it by a string. "Excuse me, are you in charge here?" "Yeah, I'm Mac. Hey, you can't be in here without a hard hat, kid. Put one on." Mac pointed to a pile of hard hats resting on the ground. Chester just looked at them and said, "I'll be okay." "You need to put on a hard hat, kid," insisted Mac. When Chester shook his head, Mac grabbed a hard hat, plopped it on Chester's head himself, and asked, "Now, what do you want, Squirt?" "Thank you. Chester pointed to a headline on the front page of the newspaper. "Bulldozer stolen." "You the ones who lost a bulldozer?" "Yeah. So?" Chester said, "So, I'm your new bulldozer." Mac was very confused. "Come again?" "I'm your new bulldozer," repeated Chester. "I don't have time for jokes, kid. Now you get out of here." Instead of leaving, Chester put down the weight, walked over to one of the boulders, and ripped it out of the ground. He carried it over to the dump truck and flipped it into the cargo area and back. The mouths of Mac and the construction workers dropped as they watched him. Chester walked back to Mac. "Like I said, I'm your new bulldozer." "Wow, that's impressive, kid, but sorry, I can't hire you. There are child labor laws, and besides, shouldn't you be in school?" asked Mac. "Reach into the inside of my suit jacket," replied Chester. Mac hesitated, but Chester nodded for him to do it. Mac reached into the pocket and pulled out a letter, which he carefully unfolded and read. He looked at Chester, surprised. "You Graham Manley's son?" Chester nodded. Mac continued, "What happened to your father was a tragedy. He's a good man, a real good man, the best." Mac read the rest of the letter. He refolded it and placed it back into Chester's suit pocket. "A letter from a judge explaining why labor laws don't apply to a child. Just when I thought I saw it all. All right, I can hire you, but just till we get the bulldozer replaced, okay? How much do you want?" "How much does it cost to rent a bulldozer for a day?" asked Chester. $300. "I'll take it." "All right, you got it." At Oak High, the three bullies eagerly waited outside the teacher's classroom. Suddenly, the door seemingly flew open on its own. A moment later, George reappeared after being invisible and closed the door behind him. "All right, super freak, give me the camera," demanded Kurt. George handed Kurt the camera. The other boys quickly gathered around Kurt as he advanced the images on the video display. The first picture was of the floor. The next was the wastebasket. Then there was a shot of a wall, taken crookedly, a bright light, George's feet, a closed drawer, and a chalkboard. George, who was standing off to the side, asked, "Well, how'd they come out?" The boys glared at him and walked toward him, all three punching their fists into their hands. George cried out, "Wait! I told you I can't see while I'm invisible." The quitting whistle at the construction site blew. "All right, boys, that's a wrap," yelled Mac. Chester placed the last boulder onto the dump truck and walked over to him. "Any word on the bulldozer?" "Nope. Looks like we'll need you again tomorrow," replied Mac. "Good first day." "Great, thanks." Chester started to leave when Mac hollered, "Whoa, wait a minute." Chester turned back to Mac. "What?" Mac pointed to Chester's head. "That's our hard hat." "Oh, yeah, I forgot about that." Chester looked around and thought for a moment, then smiled and did a handstand. The hard hat fell off his head. Chester stood, picked up his 100-pound weight with the newspaper tied to it, and walked off, leaving the hard hat on the ground as he waved and said, "Have a good night." Mac looked at the hard hat, looked at Chester, then looked at the hard hat again and picked it up. He tossed the hard hat onto a pile with the other ones. Looking up from her knitting, George's mother checked her watch. She and George's father sat in the living room on the first floor of their little house. "Where can he be?" she wondered aloud. Her husband didn't look up from his newspaper. "I hope nothing's happened." Just then the front door opened and George entered, eyes downcast. He immediately made his way to the stairs. A large, fancy vase sat on a table near the bottom of the stairwell. His mother got out of her chair. "There you are! Finally! Where have you— Oh, my goodness! What happened to your eyes?" George self-consciously held his hands over his eyes. "Come here," demanded his mother. George reluctantly obeyed. She removed his hands from his face and examined the big black circles around his eyes. "Who did this to you? Or did you try to walk around invisible again?" George pushed her hands off his face and pulled away. "Let me go upstairs to my room." "Don't you dare pull away from me," shouted his mother. George didn't say anything as he made himself invisible. A moment later, the beautiful vase toppled over and shattered. "Oh, my vase!" cried George's mother. George's father stood and whipped the newspaper onto the floor. "That's it. You're grounded for the next month, mister." Chester stood on a bridge over the highway, watching people drive home from work. Whenever he saw a truck, he motioned like he was sounding a truck's horn by raising and pulling down his arm. If the truck driver saw Chester, he sounded the truck's horn as he drove under the bridge. A Corvette raced by on the shoulder of the expressway, followed by several police cars with sirens blaring. Chester smiled. Wow, a police chase. He felt like a kid, and a normal one at that, for the first time in months. The Corvette zipped along the shoulder. Someone inside tossed jars out the car's open window, which shattered when they hit the pavement. As the police cars rolled over the glass, their tires popped and they crashed into each other. Inside the Corvette, two thugs looked back at the crashing police cars and laughed. They did not notice the small, yellow car they passed as they continued racing ahead. Julie, wearing the same tracksuit she had on in Valanis's Superflaws file folder, jumped out of the yellow car and raced after the Corvette. The thug in the passenger seat turned around, watching Julie. "Some gal is chasing us." "Who is this girl?" asked the driver. "I don't know, but she sure is fast." When the Corvette exited the expressway, Julie followed them up the ramp. The car sped through the stop sign at the top and made a hard right turn. Julie tried to slow herself down, but she couldn't. She ran across the street, put out her hands to brace herself, and slammed into a building. Peeling herself off the building, Julie took the same right turn as the Corvette and continued her pursuit. The driver of the car said, "She's still behind us." He tried to shake her off, this time by making a sharp left. The two thugs watched as Julie turned her head toward them but continued to run forward. Julie again tried to slow down but ended up crashing into a garbage truck. As the garbage fell all over her, she disappeared in the pile of waste. A moment later, she popped up, brushed herself off, and walked back to the street where she had seen the Corvette turn left. She made the turn and started running again after the car. People on the street saw only a blur as she raced by. Suddenly, Julie saw something ahead. She had to stop. She looked for a way to put on the brakes and grabbed hold of a lamp post. Her momentum swung her around and around the post while her legs kept running. She frowned, knowing what she had to do to stop. After she let go of the post, she flew across the street, crashing into a pile of garbage cans placed by the curb for pickup. She stood, frustrated, her uniform splattered with ooze and bits of garbage. As she brushed herself off, she walked back to where she had seen the something that made her want to stop. It was the Corvette, now stuck in a large web. The doors were open, and the two crooks from the car dangled from a streetlight, all wrapped up in spider silk. She saw a note pinned to one of them and snatched it. "Beaten again by a superhero," she groaned after reading it. Julie crumpled up the note and threw it onto the ground. She bent over, shook her hair, and pulled out a banana peel. As she did so, cans, peels, wrappers, and bottles fell out. Disgusted, she gave her hair one last shake. A rat fell out and scurried down the street. Julie stormed away, very mad. From a rooftop across the street, someone videotaped the entire incident. It was espionage with a video camera. He watched through the lens as Julie left. "Perfection," he said. "Perfection."